Hayden, and when you were young, did you want to be a writer and why?
Oh, very good question. Yes, I always wanted to be a writer since I was 7. The reason why was because I read these great books. I was always reading books, and I watched loads of TV and loads of movies, anything that told me a story. And I love the way that when you read a book, you get dragged inside this story, and it feels like you actually go on this adventure with these characters. So I kind of knew from the age of 7 that I wanted the chance to be able to create that feeling for other people as well. So I loved books so much. I loved what they did to me. I loved how magical they were, and I wanted to do that. I thought, wouldn't that be just the coolest job in the world to be an author when I was older? So I started writing my very first story when I was 7, and it's about a man made out of cheese. But it wasn't very good. Any other questions?
Any other questions from there at all?
Hi, I'm Madeline, and who inspired you to write stories?
Oh, who inspired me? I had great teachers when I was at school, and they loved their books, and they were really encouraging whenever I wrote my silly, wacky cheeseman stories. But also, of course, all the books that I read. I loved Dr. Seuss. There are so many books I loved as a kid. One of my favourite books was by a man called Norman Hunter, and he wrote a book called Professor Brainstorm about this mad, wacky professor who invents all these great, incredible inventions that inevitably at some point exploded or slimed people or, So I was into slime and things blowing up from a very young age.
Hi, I was just wondering, I read all the books. Why did you choose to finish with the final person and not continue on with the book?
And what's your name?
Nicola.
Nicola. Hi, Nicola. Nicola, hi, Nicola. Look, I loved writing about Max and Lyndon, but I always wanted to finish before I started to get a bit bored and before it started to feel like a real kind of chore to write about them. So I wanted to finish while I was still excited, because I think if you're not excited about what you're writing, I think people can read that. So I thought if I finish with number 10, that's kind of a nice even number. And also it gave me an aim to kind of really make number 10 the biggest, kind of most explosive book of all. So, but the thing was too, Nicola, when I finished it, I actually did get quite sad. For about 2 weeks, I felt really kind of a bit strange and a bit, just a bit sad and a bit grumpy. And I realised after a while it was because I missed them, and I was going to miss writing about them, because they become like your best friends. They become like, they were like my little brother and sister, and that's how your characters need to be when you write stories. That's how well you need to get to know them. I'm not sad anymore, and I don't burst into tears at bus stops like I used to.
Another question from Engadine.
Hi, I'm Jess. Who's your favourite author?
Oh, Jess, that is such a hard question. There are so many. There are too many, and there are so many Australian authors that I think are brilliant and fantastic. They're some of the best in the world. So, Jess, I just can't. If I start, then I'll be here for another, 3 hours, and that could get a little boring. There are just so many. There are too many to mention.
Okay. We might get a question from the beautiful students who are in the room with Deb. Do you want to turn around and ask?
Hayes Park. Okay, who hasn't had a chance to say anything just yet? Yes.
What would your next book be about?
Oh, my next book. I've spoken a little bit today to Adi and a few other kids here about my next book. I'm very excited about my next book. It's a little bit different. The book that's just come out that I've written is about ghosts, and I want to talk to you a little bit about ghosts in a second, because I love ghosts. But my next book that I'm writing at home, and when I go home after this afternoon, I'll continue writing this one, is about an old city, and it's been flooded. So it's a little bit inspired by Venice as well. But it's totally, totally flooded, so that all that exists now are building tops, scattered like little islands in this little city. Now, most people were able to get out and be saved, but a couple of groups of kids were left behind. So they need to work out new ways to live. So they've invented flying foxes to get from one building top to the other. They have flying machines, and there's sea monsters, and there's evil harbour lords living in the middle of the harbour. So that's kind of what I'm writing about at the moment. There's underwater machines, and there's all sorts of stuff. So I'm quite excited about that one. Super.
How long does it take to write a book?
Oh, Caitlin, that's a great question. With with a lot of my books, it depends on the thinking part and how quickly the idea comes together. But once I've got the idea and then I start to plan it, the planning part's very, very important for me because I need to get to know my characters before I start writing my story. Then I'll write the first draft, and then with the help of an editor who's kind of like my own personal teacher, he will then give me suggestions on ways of making it better. Then I'll rewrite it 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 times. While I'm doing that, the illustrator is actually coming up with the illustration. So what's going to go on the front, what's going to go on the back. And this one here, for example, is the very first drawing ever of Max Remy. And if you know Max Remy at all, that's pretty much exactly how she ended up being. So that's the very first drawing of Max. So once the illustrator's done all of those drawings, and then about 5 different people read the book to make sure all the spelling is correct, then it goes to the printer and looks like a book. That takes about a year. So pretty much from the start to the finish, sometimes longer. The ghost book that I've just written is taking longer, and the book I just told you about, the flooded city called Grimston, is taking longer as well. Thanks, Caitlin. My very latest book that I've brought out is called The Remarkable Secret of Aurelie Bonhoeffer. Now, I've always been fascinated by ghosts. My mum's family are very, very haunted. Ghosts used to turn up all the time in my nana's house, and it was this big old wooden house with this big old veranda around the side, and it used to sit quite high in the street and it kind of looked over all the other houses, but it was completely haunted. And my nana used to tell me about ghosts that would turn up all the time, but not in a scary way. She'd tell me these stories like ghosts would turn up, relatives who had died, and they would turn up at the end of the table for dinner. And she also used to tell me about Grandpa. And I never knew if my nana was just spinning stories, if she was telling the truth. But I'd say to her, tell me about Grandpa again. And she'd say, sure, what do you want to know? And I'd say, well, do you still see Grandpa? And she'd say, oh, yes, I see him every night. And I'd say, but Grandpa's dead. And she'd say, oh, yes, he died about 10 years ago now. And I'd say, but aren't you scared? She'd say, oh, I'm not scared of your Grandpa. We were married for 40 years. And she said, he was more scared of me. And I'd say, well, what does he do when he can't? Like, how does he appear? And she said, oh, well, he looks like he always did. He comes and sits on the end of my bed at night before I go to sleep, and we have a bit of a chat. But he was always a show-off, your Grandpa. So one thing he does every night is he juggles. He juggles, he was always a show, and he's always looking for new things to juggle. So he juggles octopuses, jars of pickles. He juggled my slippers last night. So she'd tell me these stories about these relatives who kind of just liked coming back as ghosts. So I thought, wouldn't it be great to tell a story about a young girl who has ghosts in her life, but they weren't scary at all. Now, I don't want to tell you what the secret is because I'm running a creative writing competition on my website right now that I want to tell you about, and it's to do with what the secret is. But what I want to do is I want to read you a little bit of this book. So it's The Remarkable Secret of Aurelie Bonhoeffer. And I want you to start thinking, if you were writing a story about a young girl and you knew there were ghosts in her life somewhere, what do you think the family's remarkable secret could be?
How many times did you have to rewrite the Max Remy books?
Good question. Look, with the first one, I did have to write it quite a few times because I was still learning about the characters and still learning about, you know, the story and all the rest. As I got on and I knew the characters very, very well, there was less rewriting. So probably towards the end, I probably only rewrote them about 3 times before I was quite happy with them. And then there's still the proofreading. There's still 5 adults sitting down individually and checking all the spelling. And even then, sometimes spelling mistakes go through. So with Aurelie, I rewrote it more like 5 or 6 times to try and get it just how I wanted it to be.
From the big thank you from the Premier's Reading Challenge to Deb, and a big thank you to Dymocks Literacy Foundation for supporting us with this.
Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you to Hayes Park for being with me and keeping me company here. And to all of you out there, I hope you're all planning on reading books for the Premier's Reading Challenge, and also not just for the challenge, reading books for the rest of your life, because it's one of the best, most fun things you can do. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here today.
And I have questions.
Bye.